Hey guys, Claire Cantor here with Spread the Well, and I wanted to take a minute today to talk about something that I kind of have been punting, mainly because it, is a little off topic for a physical therapist, but not necessarily, because I am someone who has a lot of patients that fit into this umbrella of what I kind of consider outlier patients, meaning, a lot of my colleagues and people think, oh, she's a chronic pain specialist. And while that's not off base in the sense that I do see a lot of patients with chronic pain, and but I also tend to see a lot of people who, for whatever reason, have been sort of mismanaged in the regular medical model, right? So like, for whatever reason, the way that they present, the way that they respond to a specific treatment is not the norm. And because of that, they're made to feel like, sorry, we can't help you, right? And so the issue that I have with getting hyperfixated or overly narrow-minded, tunnel vision on things like evidence-based practice, while I get why it's so important that something that's proven time and time again to be successful is important, but it does not take care of the entire patient population. So, there's a range of percentage of people who will respond favorably, and thus the evidence will show that if someone comes in with this specific diagnosis or this presentation, when we do this, it helps, okay? So that's great for the people that are helped, right? What about those that aren't? That has to be extremely frustrating. And so not all of those people are chronic pain individuals, but what they are and what I'm able to provide for them is to be able to think a little bit outside the box and use, there are different pillars of evidence-based practice that are not what we consider sort of the research, right? And this has been looked at and tested in all these different ways, and it continues to show, positive results. But that, two things that are really important to me as a clinician. One is my own clinical intuition. This, I guess, the art of what I do when I hear a history, when I hear a story, when I feel someone's body and the way something kind of presents to me, then I'm, guided. So ridiculous. This is why it's very hard for me to treat engineers who want a very specific discussion about what I'm doing on their body. So clinical intuition. The other is the patient response, like not the immediate patient response, but the patient's input of, hey, you did this last time. I felt great, right? You didn't do it the first time. Didn't feel as good, right? And so, part of just this reciprocity, this listening to your patient, this therapeutic alliance, is that I don't make goals that are something that objectively makes sense for me and all humans or most humans. I make goals based on what you want out of treatment or what you want to improve in your quality of life and all of that. And what your interpretation of what I did or what someone else does matters. So if we're going to sit here and discuss if ice is better or not better, or we shouldn't be icing, or we should be heating and we shouldn't be heating, or we should, TINS is so stupid, it doesn't even, if a patient comes to me and says, I really like that, it worked, I felt, why am I gonna challenge that narrative, right? And so anyway, that's jumps off soapbox. So I treat a lot of patients that have not had their needs met in the regular medical model. And these tend to be patients that have just something a little bit off. And the hard part of that is that even when I can send them to a specialist that maybe, so, these are the people that like, they're always inflamed, or their tissue has a really distinct feel where they're inflamed, they're boggy, and so I'm like, okay, well, let's get an inflammatory workup with rheumatology. Well, their inflammatory markers, they're not off, right? No, you're fine. So imagine being told the normal stuff doesn't work. And now the specialist, okay, this guy's going to come to that first, it also doesn't work, right? So your objective tests that we have for, so blood work and inflammatory markers and all of those things are also not reporting an accurate read of, or they're not reflecting or matching what's happening in our body or what we're complaining of. So there's a lot of individuals who I'm seeing that have, chronic inflammatory, they feel tired all the time. They feel a lot of pain. They're exhausted. They're tight all the time. They feel like they need body work all the time. And there's an interesting recurrence, and this is not every single patient, but there is a lot of connective tissue dysplasia, this hypermobility, right? And the way that I would always describe to patients, and without being like, you're hypermobile, that's a specific problem, but more in the sense of that's an important thing for you to understand. So, let's look at every disease or disorder has a spectrum, right? And the hypermobility spectrum or the connective tissue dysplasia spectrum is big and wide. And you've got on one end the really significant, more impactful conditions like the genetic conditions, Ehlers-Danlos and Marfan's and those sort of things that not only am I just loosey-goosey, my ligaments are loose, I'm double jointed, all of that stuff, but systemically, that all of my organ systems are supported by connective tissue. And if my connective tissue is not adequate, then my organ systems are not going to be functioning the way they need to. So that's on one end. On the other end, you've got people who are just hypermobile. They're more flexible. They are, double jointed. They are good at swimming and good at gymnastics and good at dancing and good pitchers and all of those things. And that is wonderful when you're swimming, pitching, gymnastics, dancing. And but what about when you aren't, right? So these things, these little superhuman, this is good. I'm super flexible. I'm a gymnast, right? That are so helpful in one instance that when they're no longer utilized in that way or needed in whatever way, that start to kind of set us up for problems. So anyone on that spectrum of hypermobility, your tissue, so because my connective tissue, ligaments, my joint capsules, the things that are supportive in nature in my body are not as strong, okay? Then what happens is your nervous system picks up on, this joint's a little bit more mobile, right? Oakley, come. Oakley. And so the reaction is that the muscles have to overprotect to support the joints, right? So these are the people who are tight all the time, right? And then they read that because we have this narrative that we've been bought into that if I feel tight, I need a stretch, right? And if you haven't, go back to my stretch series videos where I talk specifically about hypermobility patients not needing to stretch, right? These are my patients that they're dislocating a joint to try to get that stretch, which they'll never get, right? And really the reason that urge to stretch is there is because some muscles are firing so hard to support the joint structure. And those people, if you are walking around and constantly having a system that is, our joints were designed to play, right? They move, I mean, dare I say the word sublux? I don't want to be scary or anything, but our joints are moving and our nervous system recognizes that they're doing that safely. And people who move more, right? Sometimes their nervous systems can register, well, that's just our norm. But then other times, maybe we reach a certain age or we stop swimming and now that excessive tissue mobility poses a threat, right? And it turns on a threat response in our system, okay? So, again, and then generating this idea that if my nervous system, stress reactivity system is kicked on, which it does in response to threat, right? So that's not only the root of our pain experience, but just sensory processing in general. If my nervous system interprets something as dangerous or threatening, we're going to mount some protective response, right? That includes a lot of immune response and a lot of inflammation, all of that stuff. So if you're constantly generating this, like, what's that, and it ramps up this response, you're going to have more inflammatory problems. You're going to have more muscle tension guarding. You're going to have more pain conditions and stuff like that. So I wanted to say that the super interesting thing that has come up, and it got personal because and I personally did some genetic testing after reading this amazing book, Outlive by Peter Attia, and this idea that the future of medicine is in genetics, right? It's this idea that we have this story, right? Our genes are written, here's where we are, and we have predispositions to certain things. So if I am someone who is going to have a negative reaction, the moment that I have an exposure to the SARS-CoV virus for the first time, that's written in the plan, right? Same thing for vaccines. So we have this set of genes, and even those genes can be sort of upregulated or downregulated based on our experiences, right? And so what I think the future of medicine relies in this very prevention, early detection, wellness type of thing. So Peter Attia's thought process is, I don't need to do a CBC every year unless I'm truly tracking the trend of what's happening. But I need to look at these very specific genes. And if my patient, has an ApoB or whatever the very specific gene is that is the most problematic for cholesterol problems that are associated with cardiovascular disease, I need to know that. And we need to be proactive about statins or diet change, right? Or just things like that. So it becomes precision medicine. And so again, and one of his examples is we wait till 50 to get our colonoscopy. But what if someone's got this genetic marker that we have seen, maybe there's not a direct correlation, but we've seen across the board that every single person that ends up with a colon cancer has this, right? We know that ahead of time. Those are my patients that are going to start getting colonoscopies at 30, not 50, right? I'm not ordering colonoscopies for people. This is a kind of an example of how he gets. So genetics gives us a story and allows us to be really proactive about our health. Okay, so genetics is super important to my family. We have a child with a genetic epilepsy. What that means is if her PCDH19 gene was not a variant, was not a mutation, she would not have epilepsy. Okay, so it's just as simple as that. So we've connected certain gene mutations to certain diseases. But the truth is that there's a much bigger picture with certain genes that are maybe not directly linked to a disorder or a diagnosis, but that are linked to a collection of symptoms, right? And maybe we're just not at the point yet where we can say, oh, this means this, right? So I am getting off on a tangent only to say that my family in particular, we went into a deep dive on genetics, and we've been super interested in this gene, the MTHFR gene, okay? It has been, the lay people have tossed around the term, the mother, you-know-what gene, because it's a problem. And it's one of these problems that is such a low-grade problem, and it's such an obscure that we like, hey, there's correlation, but there's not a true connection. And, there hasn't been enough evidence to say every single person that has this also has this. So we're getting feedback from a lot of physicians, which I get it, is that gene mutation is not associated with any disorder or diagnosis. But in several of my patients who are the outlier patients who have true connective tissue dysplasia, hypermobility that's not otherwise diagnosed with some specific condition, and some of which, not all of which, have gotten a workup from rheumatology or these other, have gotten inflammatory markers checked, have gotten, an autoimmune panel and nothing comes back. So I've had lots of people uncover the fact that they have this MTHFR gene mutation in and they also have hypermobility. I'm not saying if this then that. But the interesting thing is I then have done sort of a deep dive rabbit hole on the topic of MTHFR, and then what does that look like in children? And I'm looking at 2 children of my own who have symptoms, right? Not a diagnosis, because there's no diagnosis attached to this gene, but symptoms, very specific symptoms that have started to show up in every single person that has this. So it's super interesting. And what the MTHFR gene is, and again, I'm not a geneticist, a physician, all of those things, but this is the layperson's description, is we have several systems in our body that rely on methylation. Okay, so that's a big word, but it basically means that when we take something in from our diet or from supplementation, our body needs a specific form of what we're taking in. And to get to that form, we have to methylate it. Okay. This is a very dumbed down explanation, but stick with me. Okay. So for MTHFR specifically, that is for the methylfolate. Okay. So methylfolate reductase, doesn't matter. It means that the MTHFR gene is responsible for the methylation of folic acid. So for us taking folic acid from our diet and from supplements and being able to take it to a usable form, which is methylfolate, that our cells can then use productively for lots of very important functions, including creation of red blood cells and dopamine and lots of different system supporting processes, right? We need methylfolate. We get folic acid, okay? So we've got a collection of people, of outliers, again, not the same outliers that I treat, although let's all get tested. Let's all get our genes tested. But we have a group of individuals who are being fed the same multivitamins, prenatal vitamins, pastas that are enriched with folic acid and all of that kind of stuff. And they're not able to take folic acid and turn it into methylfolate in the cell. So 2 things happen in that. One is those systems that need and require methylfolate are not being met. Okay. The other important thing is that, come here. The other important thing is that folic acid, or whatever supplement we're taking in that can't be broken down in our system, becomes a toxic overload. So when we have a toxic overload in our body, so whether it's folic acid or any other toxin, right, that for whatever reason can't be broken down to be usable or can't be broken down to be excreted from our system and becomes a toxic load, that is the generation of an immune response. So we used to describe autoimmune diseases as like, I don't know, just out of nowhere, your immune system starts attacking its body. No, there is something that is eliciting a neuroimmune response to to create healing in our body, right? Inflammation is the first line of like healing and defense. The problem is when it's not getting rid of the thing that needs to be healed or destroyed or gotten rid of, it's just going to keep generating, right? So these people who go and get an autoimmune panel or they get imaging and nothing shows anything, why is my immune system kicked on? There is a reason, right? But we've got to figure out what that reason is. Not me personally, but just in general. This is like just to get playful about understanding more about our bodies, right? And so, in the 70s and 80s, there were lots of women having babies with neural tube defects. So whether they were even carrying babies to full term and they would have spina bifida or ancephaly and, could not carry to term and, all of that kind of stuff. So what was recognized and registered is that there was a direct link between women having babies with neural tube defects and those women not having enough methylfolate. So the answer was to enrich everything with folic acid. So now prenatal vitamins have extra folic acid. At that time they were like, take Flintstones vitamins. Kids' Flintstones vitamins are loaded with folic acid, right? And so and then they put it in breads, pastas, cereals, all of this stuff. Well, that hasn't changed. We had this huge decrease in neural tube defects, right? And yet we had a huge influx in children being born with neurodivergent diagnosis, right? So again, this is not a direct correlation of like autism and all, but we have had an influx of children with neurodegenerative disorders and sensory processing disorders and ADHD and autism and all of these things. And you will not convince me that we in America are not poisoning our food system. I have patients that travel to Europe and here in America, they can't drink wine because of the tannins. They can't eat gluten. They can't eat, drink dairy. And then they go and gallivant about Italy, eating, drinking, and being merry. And they have no problems, right? They have no pain. They feel great. And then they come back here. So again, that's a pure speculation, but it's something that I'm seeing over and over again. I have not done any research studies on that, but there is a link. So there is something shifting. There is something shifting in our world that we need to recognize is having an impact on some people and not others, right? And so why do you have kids or individuals eating crap American food and not having any problems? And then you have some that are eating crap American food and they're ADHD, autistic, sensory processing, quirky, blah, all of that stuff. So what is the difference? It goes back to genetics. What is this group predisposed to that's going to make their neuroimmune systems a little bit more responsive that this other group isn't, right? And so when you are an individual, who is the individual that responds poorly to everything? COVID, these are the people who end up with long COVID, the people who felt horrible with the vaccine. I'm not talking vaccines, they are necessary in lots of terms, but there are going to be people who don't respond well to them. Why is that, right? And does every single person need to not be vaccinated because there are people that... No, but if we had any foresight to say, look, this group is not going to respond well to this. Anyway, I am digressing. I am not an anti-vaxxer. Everyone is fully vaccinated. But the point is, when you are someone who is an outlier and you don't make sense on paper and you don't get better with the norm and you respond poorly to every single thing that's out there, or you are a parent of a child who's an outlier, who responds poorly to things. Why does my child always get this? You want answers. And then our medical model and our world has convinced you not to look for answers, or anyone who's seeking answers out on their own, it's hard not to go into this fear, this rabbit hole of fear. And so there's no in between, right? And so I don't know what the point in this video is, except for the fact that get curious about your genes and your health and your children's, and don't be afraid to have conversations about genetics and about how they play into why your child presents with whatever. When you understand something about yourself, then you can be proactive about it. So I have someone near and dear to me who has spent her whole life not knowing that she had this MTHFR gene mutation. And her whole life was not super ill, has anemia, has this, has that, didn't have a lot of problems getting pregnant, but had some pregnancy problems. And the reason I said the pregnancy thing is a lot of women find out that they have MTHFR gene mutation when they have unsuccessful pregnancies, being able to get pregnant or stay pregnant. Anyway, but your system, if it's not supported, will eventually gas out, okay? So these are people who all of a sudden get some really significant neuroimmune or autoimmune condition, right? And how can you go from healthy last month to celiac disease this month, right? How does that happen? I didn't have celiac, whatever. And it's because either there's a threshold met in your system that's like, we've done all we can, we have given you alarms or not, or you finally had this one little exposure that the moment you were going to have the exposure, it was going to turn on, right? So like I have a friend who has a son who had celiac. He didn't have celiac 2 years ago, but following a COVID and a bad stomach bug, all wrapped into one, he couldn't recover. So get curious, ask why. If you are someone who is not an outlier and you're someone who does not parent an outlier, be so grateful for that. But also, you still should get curious about, about what's yours. I don't know. So I think the more we talk to our physicians about this, then the more physicians will recognize, oh, parents are not afraid to have these kind of discussions. And I'm interested in exploring, but I never want to push anyone out of a comfort zone. Get curious, right? The more we know and understand, we can start preventing things like poor responses to certain treatments, okay? I don't even know why I started this talk, but there is that. If you are someone who is hypermobile or inflamed all the time and you were always bendy and your joints are loosey-goosey and you don't feel good and you're exhausted all the time and get curious. That's what I'll say. Okay, hope I don't lose everyone on this one. Goodbye. Bam.